Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you, President Terry. We have three guests that don't really need introductions, and you didn't come here to hear me, but I did want to mention a couple things. Senator Durenberger served 16 years in the United States Senate under 4 different presidents. So one of the things I will ask him is his impressions of each of these folks: President Carter, President Reagan, President George H.W. Bush, and President Clinton. So we'll take that when we get to the questions and answer period, and I'm giving you time to prepare for that. Lori Sturdevant, who was with us a couple years ago and had a great conversation with Tom Swain, you may remember, talking about the University of Minnesota and Minnesota history, and it was wonderful. And Tom sends his greeting. Yes. And he's 97 now? Doing well. He's following this book. So, and we have, of course, Eric Eskola, who's our star reporter from Almanac. He's going to facilitate the discussion. So, without any further ado, let's have the three of them come up, and they'll each have a microphone. And Eric is going to do a facilitation and leave plenty of time for questions, 15 minutes or more. So he's got his trademark scarf on. Eric got here by public transportation. He still does not own a car.
Never have.
Never have owned a car, no.
I've saved countless tens of dollars by not having it. I worry because Max's English is better than mine, so. Why is this book called, why is the word progressive in this book? That's more like a liberal, Senator, that's more like a liberal term, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is now a liberal term, but it got used by a lot of the people who were part of this evolution of progressive republicanism in Minnesota, starting in 1938 with the election of 38-year-old or 31-year-old Harold Stassen, who called himself a liberal as well as a progressive, and then Luther Youngdahl, who succeeded him, called himself a progressive all the time.
And you call yourself part of the Stassen line, correct?
Yeah, and yes, I am part of that because I practiced law with Harold Levander, and when he became governor in 1966, he asked me to be his executive secretary. So yeah, it's kind of a piece, although it's a wide variety of Republicans in that period of time, but every one of them was progressive, and we describe what that exactly means in the book.
I looked at the let's stipulate that Stassen is kind of the godfather of the movement, and let's move ahead to 1966, because I read that platform on the Republican platform, and Lori, that's a DFL platform from the modern day.
There was so little difference that year between the Republican and the DFL platforms that at the Legislative Reference Library, I found a yellowing document that was a side-by-side comparison of the two-party platforms, and they were remarkably similar. We had in those years a center-left party and a center-right party able to function. But the 1966 election was sort of a watershed in state legislative annals because it was the first election after the first redistricting in 55 years. So suddenly, we had a legislature that really represented Minnesota after years and years of being dominated by increasingly sparsely populated rural areas. And so that it was a Republican legislature, a new Republican governor with a Republican chief of staff, Dave Durenberger, and they came in with a really aggressive pro-government, let's say, agenda.
Well, Senator, did the Levander administration get pushback from activists in the Republican Party on stuff like, sales tax increase, income tax increase, Pollution Control Agency, Met Council, Department of Human Rights? Was there pushback from the grassroots? Or?
No, all this was in the party platform. I mean, this is back when both parties were open at what we call the town hall meeting level, also called precinct caucus. Everybody would go to their town hall meeting or their precinct caucus. And they would, as a part of it, they would begin to design the political platform on which the party's leaders would stand for election. And these people would go up the line until they got to the state convention. They would adopt it as a statewide platform. And in those days, it represented Republican leadership in every part of the state. And it wasn't even, this one sounds a lot like Met Council and some of the things like that. This might be Twin Cities, or you talk about the first agency, the states' rights, or the individual rights department of the country, or Department of Labor and Industry by Republicans.
Yeah.
Well, oh my God, what are we up to these days? But that came from the grassroots, and 2/3 of the Republican platform got adopted into law by the end of 1967
And
session.
let me just interject one other thing. There was opposition within the Republican Party to the first ever sales tax enacted in the 1967 session. Some of that opposition came from Harold Levander, the governor who vetoed it, not because he was a no new taxes guy, but because he thought there should be a referendum so that people could vote on that. Another opponent was the former governor, Elmer L. Anderson, a good friend of both Dave's and mine, and a good Rotarian, let me add. Elmer thought that we should stick with the income tax because it was based on ability to pay.
My sense is that Roe versus Wade changed almost everything in Minnesota politics. And does this, how does this play into your thesis about the progressives coming and then going?
It sort of stifled what was going on at the grassroots. You know, the best example I have, and I won't use his name, is a well-known Minneapolis businessman who was retired and came home to a precinct caucus recently, and they elected him the chairman of his town precinct caucus. And so he started the meeting, and they got to the resolutions part, and the first one was to overturn Roe v. Wade. And an hour later, they were still on it, and so he just took his gavel and said, "Thank you very much for the honor of representing you, I'm going home." And this has been going on in our party, you know, almost, not since Roe v. Wade passed, but probably since the time that I got to the Senate. You began to see the effects of it in people who came over from the Democratic Party to join the Republican Party for that reason only. You also saw the effect of it on the Democratic Party, or the DFL, by people who might be pro-life, so to speak, but could not get endorsed by the DFL party because of that.
We really had an interesting coincidence of political events that were pretty formative in the early 1970s. Roe v. Wade happens soon after the Democratic Party has switched from winner-take-all internal elections to proportional representation. Those of you who were involved in the DFL in those years will remember walking sub-caucuses. That was all about proportional representation. It became impossible for a particular force to get 50% plus one at a DFL convention and really take over the party. That remained possible in the Republican Party, and that looked good to those anti-abortion folks. But the other thing that happened was Watergate at the same time. And that created a wave election. And what happens in wave elections, as we've seen as recently as this year, is that the moderates in the party tend to be the ones who lose their seats. And in Minnesota, there was such a big wave election that the Democrats, after the 1974 election, controlled 104 out of 134 seats in the Minnesota House, the highest majority, I think, of any political party in state history.
Chuck Slocum's in the audience, and he was like the youngest state GOP chair in the country, weren't you, Chuck? And he came up with the independent Republican label after Watergate. And I suppose, was that a way to moderate or separate yourself from Nixon, or what?
No, it's a way to tell you that every Republican or Democratic Party in every state is supposed to be somewhat distinctive because it's supposed to reflect the values of the people that live in that state. And as those values applied to economic change, population shifts from rural to metro areas, and as they take place, people then react to that in terms of how do we best govern in the context of change. Mm-hmm. So what Chuck was doing and what the Republicans were doing, and they had to fight every 2 years for the next 20 years to hang on to it, was saying, this is a Minnesota Republican Party, not a national party, which is starting in '95, which we ended up with, and that's the problem we have today.
Has the urban-rural split been kind of weaponized politically, and how does that set of dynamics play into the story?
I would say that it has been. It's been a factor in our politics going back to the 19th century, I think. But it has been, in recent years, really used in a different way when especially Republican candidates would say of their DFL opponents, don't vote for this DFLer if you are out in a rural district because that DFLer will vote with Minneapolis. And wouldn't that be terrible? if that happened. That is a kind of an eroding of something that was precious to a lot of folks in Minnesota politics in the era when Dave was particularly active. The old notion was both political parties should try to be competing in the whole state for the sake of a vigorous democracy in the whole state. Right, Dave?
Right. But I think it's safe to say, and this may be what you sense, because you've been at this for a long time, that people who live in rural areas, and I see Casserly and Terwilliger and a few other formers here, know that people that live in rural areas are traditionally more conservative, if you will, than people who live in urban areas. And then that's population change and a variety of things like that. And it's the challenge of living closer together and the cost of living and issues like that. So there's always been this tradition. Harold Levander, for example, I think was endorsed by the party eventually because he came from the rural, he represented the rural electric cooperatives all over the state. And he used to give a great speech about, what's right about America rather than what's wrong with America and things like that. So we've always had a degree of that. But we've always had leadership coming from, you think about the Dwayne Bensons from way down in southern Minnesota or the Bob Renners from up north, and the younger guys will think about other examples in Minnesota who came out of rural Minnesota to become leaders on statewide issues, including urban or metro as well as rural.
What impact did the kind of the no new tax pledge, the Grover Nordquist stuff, what impact has that had?
Well, that is part of, I think there's almost by the decade a moving away from the distinctiveness of a Minnesota Republican Party to more of a nationalization of our politics. You talked already about the abortion issue in the 1970s. In the 1980s, there was a movement of religious right folks that had not been politically active before into the Republican fold because Ronald Reagan expressly invited them in. And those folks tended to be suspicious of government at a lot of levels, wanting to preserve religious freedom. And so not only were they not so keen about legalized abortion, but they were interested in avoiding laws concerning same-sex marriage, liked the idea of prayer in school. All of that agenda came about. Then in the 1990s, we had the emergence of Newt Gingrich, who figures prominently in our story here. And his Contract for America that was successful in 1994 in winning the first U.S. House majority in many years was a national platform, and Republican candidates all over the country, as Dave was ending his Senate career that year, Republican candidates felt obliged because of the financial campaign finance strings attached to that to get on board with this national agenda. It's not a coincidence, I think, that the year after that election, 1995, was when the Republican Party in this state dropped the name, the word independent from its name. Since then, we've had an even greater nationalization of our campaign finance system and national strategies like some of the notions about redistricting. The fact that you're seeing right now in Wisconsin a move by Republican legislators in a lame duck session to take power away from the incoming Democratic governor and incoming Democratic attorney general, that's also part of a national strategy. Similar things happening in Michigan and Ohio and North Carolina. The national approach has superseded a lot of individualized statewide thinking, and that's a shame.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, Eric, it's very helpful to note money and the people that make money and their influence. I mean, we were named, and I think it was about 73, besides being named the state that works, which reflects the work of a lot of progressive Republicans. Wendy Anderson got credit for it by holding up a fish on Time magazine. But the reality is, this goes way back. The Republican Party also has been recognized nationally as the most productive party in the country because it raised its own money and raised it from the grassroots by neighbor to neighbor. People went door to door knocking and raising bucks. And something like, close to 50% of the party's money came from small donors, less than $100 each probably. So then became the movement towards, as the campaigns got more expensive, they had to ask more money, who had the money, and then you begin to see the shift. And Rudy and I had a conversation that he sometimes won't admit, but the reality is somewhere in the early part of the 80s saying, between the influence of the money people, in Minnesota, some of whom are seeking party chairs or party positions,
right,
and the Roe v. Wade evangelical sort of approach to things, or the conservative, rural conservative combo, if you will, which includes the no new tax people, because they see the problems as all in the metro area. They don't see them as part of their problem. The influence of people with wealth and with the financial resources to determine what the platform's going to be, who is going to stand on that platform, and what they're going to do when they get elected, kept increasing steadily.
I suppose Republicans would say, though, a lot of this was festered in the Robert Bork hearings and how the Democrats pilloried him. And I mean, it's been a group effort out there, don't you think?
No question about it. And for every action by one party, there would be a similar or even stronger reaction by the other. So we've had a kind of a tit for tat going on in the Congress with partisanship for a number of years. And that Bork episode is discussed in our book, as is a lot of what was going on. This book is kind of a hybrid between history and memoir.
Yep.
With Dave's family, between Dave and his family, they personally touch really every chapter that we include. But the last part of the book is about Dave trying to bring the progressive Republican ideas to Minnesota to the nation, having some success, but finding himself facing increasingly strong headwinds from this other movement that we're describing.
Before we take questions, let's talk a little bit about some prescriptions for change. More voting seems to be one of the suggestions you have. What form does that take?
What kind of voting?
More voting.
Oh, more.
Get more people
Yeah,
involved.
more people to vote.
Well, we had like 70-some%, didn't we, for an off-term election? So we're not really part of that problem, I don't think.
64% was Minnesota's turnout this year.
Hennepin was 73.
Yes, and it's remarkable that we had such high turnout in the city of Minneapolis. That's a big change, but that's still, when you think about it, that's still only 2 out of every 3 eligible Minnesotans voting. So we still have a ways to go.
What do you want to do to enhance that participation?
So the goal is to get better people to run and give the voters more choices. And that's why we endorse ranked choice voting. Boom, boom, boom. We've watched it work in Minneapolis. We see it starting to work in St. Paul. We wish it could work statewide, ideally. But there are other changes. There are other changes that relate to empowering the individual voter. I mean, I got a piece of legislation passed in 1995, which took down the barriers to people with disabilities voting.
Yeah.
And there were a considerable number of them, just because you couldn't get to the polling place. There's some small, simple little things, and then there's some that are more substantial and apply to everybody. But in the end, in this part of this discussion, you're going to get the money. You're going to get to the power and the influence that that financing has in order to attract good candidates. Dean Phillips can run against a strong incumbent in this district and win simply because he can afford to finance his own voice being heard. And his opponent, the incumbent, used a variety of voices. None of them sounded like him. If you know the Eric that I know, didn't sound like him.
Yeah.
Tearing down this, taking down that, da 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 da. Because he's dependent on all these other sources for his financing.
Lori, every 2 years in my career, we had a discussion of whether the caucus convention system.
Yes,
What's your sense there?
Well, and I think Dave and I aren't quite on the same page on that one. The primary system is really part of the progressive movement reforms of 100 years ago. The Theodore Roosevelt era progressives wanted to empower more average voters as compared with the big Gilded Age corporations that were the big business moguls that were then in charge of the Republican Party. And the way they saw to do that was to create primary elections. It's not a coincidence that that Wisconsin had the first presidential primary, because that was where Robert La Follette's progressive Republican ideas were really taking hold. So I'm more pro-primary, I think, than Dave is. I love the idea of people being able to come together in town hall meeting settings and talk about ideas. I think we need more of that, and not just through political parties being the conveners, but maybe through Rotary clubs and other kinds of civic groups being the conveners of those kind of conversations. But when it comes to choosing candidates, especially for statewide offices, I kind of like a primary. What do you think?
Senator?
Yeah, I think the I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the primary. I just like the idea of maximizing the voters' choices and focusing the election on like 4 people rather than 2, as an example, and then using ranked choice voting to enable people to do the sorting out. If you have the primary, then the party is going to decide. Basically the party decides. Without making judgments about the last Republican primary, I shake my head and say, oh, let's see. We had a 2-term governor who ran for president of the United States get beat by who? A member of the Hannibal County Board? How is that possible? How is that possible? So that's the sort of thing that goes through my noggin.
Questions?
Yes, sir. Okay, one of the things that I've been seeing over the last few years is the vast majority of people that are calling for term limits for congressional representatives, term limits for senators. My Lord, we have a term limit for the president. Why not for the rest of you?
That's I went to Washington with that, as I recall. This is not new. This is right after that famous actor leaned out the window and said, "I'm madder than hell. I'm gonna," that sort of thing back in 1976.
Yeah.
Well, part of that was let's limit terms, and I think I probably started running on term limits until I got there, and I found.
You got Potomac fever, and then
Okay,
that's it.
Stop, let me explain what I mean. No, once you find out, we don't have time for me to, you got to read this book to read some of the stories about, my chairman, Russell Long of the Senate Finance Committee. And what a blessing it was that he'd had all that experience. He had time to go through treatment at least 3 times and a new marriage until he straightened out, but he was just one hell of a guy. Every morning when I get up, I got a wooden crucifix in my room, and I say my prayers there. That was a gift of a Democratic senator from the state of Washington, who when I got there told me, Scoop Jackson, when I got there, he said, when all those Scandinavians got off the boat in Delaware and they came west and stopped in Minnesota, the smart ones kept going. And they're all my constituents. You can't, Pat Moynihan, I go on and on, you can't beat the value in the right setting, in the right time, the right rewards, if you will, for your productivity and your contributions. You can't beat experience. And so I changed my mind on it for that reason.
Very good friend of mine was a staffer on Capitol Hill, and he says that if there were term limits in Congress, that lobbyists and staffers would do much more of the work, and they do it quite a bit now, but they would even do more of it. And that expertise would be lost, and people would be posturing for K Street lobbyist jobs even more than they are now, because you can only serve a limited amount of time, and you'd be auditioning for a lobbying or a legal counsel job. So
I would go so far as to say that the reason the term limits idea continues to be discussed is that those special interests know it would be in their favor, and they make sure the idea keeps circulating.
Representative?
Just a comment. People would show up and vote. Term limits would not even be talked about. We just need to vote.
Yeah, it's called every 2-year election. Yeah.
Minnesota has, at the legislative level, remarkably high turnover already. There was a study done maybe 20 years ago, I don't think it's any different based on all the wave elections we've had since then, that the average tenure in the Minnesota legislature is less than 8 years. So we turn over pretty naturally here.
What about returning to every other year sessions at the Minnesota legislature?
Well, I think that's a whale of an idea. And the question is, how do you get up to speed on all these complicated issues and so forth? And my answer to that is, well, if you can't do it on your own time, why even bother? If you can't take the time to figure out what's going on in your own community and in your larger community, if this is your interest, you're motivated by public service to get involved and so forth, and you get involved at the local level, you get to be a mayor, city council mayor, maybe you get to be county commissioner and so forth. So you have a natural opportunity to see potential, positive and negative, developing. You don't have to be there all the time in order to solve those problems.
Lori, counterpoint?
Well, people who lived through that change when we moved to annual sessions in 1973-74. The 74 session was the first even year annual session. And the people who lived through that change in both parties have told me it became much harder to recruit quality candidates for the legislature. And so I have to take that seriously. But the state then had about a little less than 3 million people, and we're now 5.5 going towards 6 million people. And the state government's share of the government load, shall we say, is bigger now as a result of that. And so I think if we were to get serious about what this legislative calendar reform is a good idea. I very much, watching Wisconsin, I'm very much against what's with any opportunity for lame duck sessions. But so in the odd-numbered years, some kind of a regularly scheduled fall session, and then maybe a very short, regularly scheduled, I'm talking 2 weeks in the even-numbered spring. That
Right.
might work. Might work.
Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of limits, you mentioned in your discussion that one of the bigger changes that occurred was when wealthy individuals and at this point now large corporations began making much larger contributions to specific candidates, and that brought a significant change to politics in Minnesota. Could you speak to the interest of many in limiting campaign contributions, specifically for those wealthy individuals and wealthy corporations that do not have a particular connection to Minnesota? They don't reside, they don't do business, et cetera. And the changes that that has brought.
I mean, it's going to have to come voluntarily. I mean, because the Supreme Court said it's part of freedom of speech to spend as much money as you want. Before that, they said if you are a wealthy person, you get to spend as much money as you want also. And so there's a history to this. What is freedom of speech and what are our rights? The opportunity that you have, of course, at the state level, I suppose, is to restrict what it is you're going to tolerate by way of individual, where did the money come from, that sort of thing. And I don't know how far you get with it without changing the freedom of speech clause. But I just have to start with something other than that because I'm afraid it takes too long to get the Supreme Court to change, particularly the present one, to change its mind. So I focus more on how do you get better people to run for office. And that what gets me to focus on Bloomington, or on Hennepin County, or the local school board, or people who are active already in some form of community activity, and look for those people and give them an opportunity to shine their light in some fashion on a larger level so that others can recognize their value. But then that gets you to the problem of how do you get on the ballot? And how do you finance your own campaign against the money? And so right now, other than changing the court, I don't know how we.
Well, you could take all limits off and just have instant sunshine disclosure.
Disclosure would certainly help.
Because
And-
now a lot of those contributors to dark money organizations aren't revealed.
Yep, that's good.
Disclosure would help, and then another thing that would help, and I heard a hopeful note at a conversation yesterday about this, that apparently some of the national analysts who come into this district, the 3rd district, and looked at the Dean Phillips, Eric Paulson race, have concluded that Eric Paulson's very negative advertising backfired. Now, some of that advertising was indeed paid for by Eric Paulson's campaign, but much of it was paid for his independent expenditure allies, national deep-pocketed corporate sources. If the message is out that tactic doesn't work and actually backfires, that's a good message as far as I'm concerned.
The Washington campaign specialists, though, get paid in large measure on the TV commercials they place. And so there's a perverse incentive for those folks to get paid the maximum amount to contend that negative or positive commercials on TV work, because that's how they get a lot of their income. So
You've all expressed concern about voting. What about a voter ID rule, and do you each comment on how you think that would help or hurt voting turnout?
Editorially, the Star Tribune opposed that amendment in 2012 because we see very little evidence of the kind of fraud in Minnesota that a photo ID would get at. There was very little evidence of voter impersonation. people coming in and pretending to be somebody else and voting. It doesn't seem to happen very much. We do know that people who are elderly and who don't no longer drive sometimes don't have the proper ID. We know that people who are born in the South, and particularly if they're black, born in the South before 1950, often don't have birth certificates. We know that there would be certain people for whom a photo ID would be an extraordinary burden, and we don't see a strong need for it. We know that around the country, photo IDs requirements have been used to try to suppress rather than increase the vote, and we're actually interested in seeing more people vote, not fewer.
Yes, sir.
At the same time, Lori, there seems to be kind of this momentum. Oregon is leading the way toward electronic voting and mailed-in voting, and it seems to me that leads to a potential problem that whether it be a union or a business or a church, everybody will say, hey, bring your ballots, we'll all fill them out together. You know, and that worries me a lot that people don't pay attention to that. Do you have any feeling on electronic versus mail voting, or mail voting versus the secret ballot?
Well, editorially, we've always opposed electronic voting. Too easy to hack, and who knows who's doing that hacking. Yeah, Minnesota has been very smart to stick with paper ballots that can be recounted. We have enough need to recount with close elections in the state. It's, well, that District 5A race that was an election night, 4 votes for the was the DFLers margin. By the next day, it was 8 votes. They recounted it, and it was 11 votes. We need to be able to do that in Minnesota, to be able to do that recount. So I'm against electronic voting, and there's a proposal to do a mail-in ballot for the presidential primary. And I'm ordinarily not keen on mail ballots for what you described, but our presidential primary vote in Minnesota is not binding. It's advisory.
I thought it was going to be binding this time.
Well, help me out with that. Is that?
I'm not sure.
You're
the editorial person. You know better than I. I'm retired.
Our presidential primary, I think, is non-binding. At least in the Republican Party, I think that's
okay.
True.
All right.
So it doesn't seem, if you're going to try a mail election, that might be the one to try.
Way in the back.
Hi. Given the perceived and real divide between urban and rural, talk to us about your thoughts on Governor-elect Walz coming in from the 1st Congressional District and governing for the whole state.
Great, I'll be glad to. In fact, my next meeting is of the committee of those of us who are advising the governor on a variety of things. But, you know, the best way to change it is what the DFL has done, whether it wanted to do it or not, or whether its progressive wing likes this or not, so-called progressive wing, likes it or not, and that is pick a Tim Walz. If we had a Tim Walz to run, you know, I'd say we'd beat him. That's what I'd like to believe, and you could read this book as to how, you know, what kind of people it takes to do that. But at least we'd stand ready, and it isn't just talking. It isn't just talking one Minnesota and all that sort of thing. You start with that, but that's got to be who you are. That's what Walz is. He is that person. He's a coach, he's a teacher, he's the highest ranking enlisted man in the United States Congress, and he's not going to change. He's basically, that's who he is. I don't know how he's going to do how well he's going to do as governor, but you find a Republican or somebody who will say, I am a progressive Republican. I think that my party has a better way to think about the role of government and at what level it is best exercised than the Democrats have, you know? And I think that is the key in a state like Minnesota to make this thing work again.
Well, I was just saying, I'm the history geek in our little team here, our book writing team. And my read of Minnesota history, and maybe some of you have heard me say this before, is that we succeeded by aggregating our resources, a willingness to, in the 19th century, put the center of government, the center of education, and the center of commerce all at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, and make it possible to have a true metropolitan area, which gave this state great strength in the 20th century. And then in the 20th century, the willingness to aggregate our resources at the state level for education and public services of all kinds. That's been a secret to our success, and this rural-urban divide is toxic to that. And we have to get past that, and I'd like to see that be a top agenda item for this next governor.
Senator? Okay, fine.
There may not be time. This may be a subject for a whole another program, but hi, Senator Dave. Would you comment on the direction of healthcare going forward?
Oh, yes, and I'll try to do it briefly. Number one, on health reform, health system reform, it's been my life. I brought it from Minnesota because that's where I first discovered in 1966 from a doctor named Paul Elwood that the biggest mistake we made was not passing Medicare and Medicaid in Washington. It was giving the opportunity to Blue Cross and Blue Shield to run the system, i.e. the doctors and the hospitals. And if they can bill from the beginning reasonable and customary fees for services, the costs are going to go through the roof. And by 4 years after Paul told me that, Richard Nixon was making a speech on the same subject, saying we can't afford this healthcare system. You know, that was in 1969. Richard Nixon said we can't afford it. So we've been trying, and on my watch, always apolitical, bipartisan, call it what you will, because this is a huge challenge. It's a huge deal. Where we're at today is I'm part of an organization called United States of Care. The guy who put it together is from Edina. His name is Andy Slavitt. He's raising $100 million to take politics out of healthcare. And we're going from New Mexico to Utah to Minnesota to North Carolina. We're going state by state by state by state. And we've met in Minnesota now several times. And what I hear is I've watched the Minnesota people in the healthcare business and system and what you call it, whatever it is, they are so anxious to get politics out of healthcare. They want to get it out. Anybody who is knowledgeable about this is all for getting rid of the politics. So they come to the meetings. They want to find out what can we do better? What can we do different? Our job is not to tell you how to do it. I have my own favorite way. It's an old-fashioned one, and it says that everybody ought to be entitled to and have some kind of form of subsidy financing to have a membership in a health company. Call it Allina Health or Fairview Health or Health Partners or Essentia Health or Sanford Health or Mayo Health or whatever it is. You can have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-year membership. And you know if you bought a 5 or 6-year membership, it would be a heck of a lot cheaper than buying 1 year at a time. Because the incentive for you is to stay healthy. That's why you join. You know, that's why you're here. You don't like calling the doctor. You don't like being hauled in if you don't have to be. And the incentive for them is to hold the rates down. So you both have the same incentive. On this year-to-year basis, it's a big game. It isn't going to work. So that's my approach to answering your very good question, Mayor. I appreciate it.
Couple more. Got time, Jim? Couple more? Yeah, Senator?
Yes, and this returns back a little bit earlier to talking about selection of candidates and quality of candidates. And candidates who have had some form of training in leadership or understanding. How long do you think before we are going to finally realize that the precinct caucus system does not yield up this type of leadership out of the precinct caucus system on affairs? And the reason I say that, when I first went to precinct caucuses, there'd be 160 people in the room. The last one I went to, which was last spring, we're supposed to select 10 delegates. Only 6 people were in the room for a whole precinct. And you look at it and say, you're not going to get people who are going to follow up the hill coming out of that type of a situation, it doesn't seem to me. But how long before we're going to go back and again to your native South Dakota, Lori and my native South Dakota, to a direct primary where you access the ballot by petition and you go to a primary system and forget that I don't look like a grassroots because I'm not a grassroots. I mean, this myth that we have grassroots people choosing candidates is somewhat of a myth. And when do you see us?
Yeah, right. You may be accusing me of oversimplification, but if my answer to your question is after this meeting, I'm going to get Chuck Slocum aside, and we're going to put together a corporation called the Independent Republican Party of Minnesota, and we're going to start from the grassroots, building our own precinct caucuses and our own. Well, you don't have to be the chair. I'll get somebody else to be the chair. But I need you to tell me, how do we go to the Secretary of State? How do we incorporate it? But we're going to have the word Republican in there. You don't have to have the progressive, because right now the media has assigned that to somebody else. But except in our book, which we haven't even waved a book in front of these people yet. But
I should say quickly, there are some over there for sale. Right?
oh, really? Oh, good.
From
We're
my
here to
basement.
sign them.
Yeah, fresh
Right.
from my basement, and we'll sign them.
Anyway, I don't want to. That's a great question, but I want to say I think it's as simple as starting our own party and just use a name that is a recognized name, Independent Republican Party of Minnesota.
Before you
and let's
go-
start putting it together.
Before you start moving books, let's ask Jim's question. You give me a sentence on these 4 presidents that you.
3 sentences.
Yes.
Carter was first.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter's the first. Walter Mondale was his vice president. Jimmy Carter was not as experienced as you might like to have someone be to be president of the United States, particularly in 1976, 77, 78, 79, and 80. It was a time of economic change, turmoil. The world was, raising its fists. The Saudis and their friends in OPEC were taking down the oil markets, upping the oil markets by taking down the supply. This was their second go-round. Inflation was going through the roof. Interest rates were higher than inflation. It was and then to say nothing of what was going on in national security. But Jimmy was not up for the job, if you will. You can tell he was personally prepared for it, but for that particular period of time, it was really difficult. Ronald Reagan is another story. Doesn't make any difference when Ronald Reagan got it, whether he had been president when Nixon was president or he was president here, and that would be his last chance because of his age. But the reality is that what made Ronald Reagan was a good president is seen from the inside, and again, you can get this in the book, but it's the leadership of the Senate. We had 17 people who were progressive Republicans in the Senate. We had 54 Republicans in the Senate for the first time in 30 years that we had control. Our leader was Howard Baker of Tennessee. And Ronald Reagan had the good judgment to hire the guy that was trying to beat his brains out in the primary to run as his vice president. And when he became vice president, George H.W. Bush brought Jim Baker with him. Jim Baker is still the best political person and policy person and human being in America. And so you had this incredible gift to the American people of a president who could communicate from the west side of the Capitol to everybody in this country in language they understood, the language of hope, the language of expectation, the language of if not us, who, if not now, when, combined with a Senate that had enough people who could reach across the aisle to do a raft of good legislation against, that tide of an adverse economy. And then to pull the president back when he went too far, he insisted the first year that you do 10-10-10 cuts in the rates. And we told him ahead of time what would happen, but he's brand new president, so he let it happen. We voted for it, and down went the economy even farther. We pulled it back after 1983 because he was up for re-election in '84. He increased it. He took the taxes right back up again. You think that could be done today? Of course not. But he did it because it was a practical thing to do, and because Howard Baker and Jim Baker and this bipartisan process within the Senate of the United States actually made it possible. George H.W. Bush learned from that, and on his watch, the Soviet Union went down. First, the Berlin Wall went down. The Soviet Union went down. The East joined the West. You've read about how he did that. By then, George Mitchell, the Democratic leader, had been in the Senate as long as I was. He came in shortly after I did. George had watched through this whole Reagan thing. He had watched Howard Baker working with the president, and then he watched Bob Dole working with the president. And when H.W. Bush became the president of the United States, George Mitchell said, I think the greater American value for the Senate is to have a Republican president signing the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act, the Civil Rights Restoration Act. There's a whole significant slew of important legislation that got passed on H.W. Bush's, for which, of course, he gets credit, but who cares about the credit? It was what was in those bills was Republican and Democrat contribution. And George did that because he knew the House was more liberal than the Senate. If you let a bill go to the House without 3 champions, and I happen to be on 3 of those bills, 3 people who would come back with the Senate version of the bill, not modified in any big way by the House, then the president would sign it. And that's the big difference between leadership, broadly construed. Bill Clinton, was Bill Clinton, and I won't even try to describe him other than, you couldn't resist the guy's charm. I mean, that's what all my colleagues said about him when they first met him. It's like, wow, how can you beat this? But from the day he got elected, he was up against Newt Gingrich, Phil Gramm, Dick Cheney, a whole group of House people who swore to make him a one-term president. And they failed in making him a one-term president, but they won control of the Congress in 1995. And then they told their members, leave your families at home, don't bring them to Washington. We don't want former senators talking about a crucifix, from a Democrat from Washington State, We just want to get the business that has to get done, and that was it. And that's all I'll say about presidents. But
Well, we all want to thank Senator Durenberger for his past and future and present service to our state and country. We also want to thank Lori Sturdevant, who ends her full-time punditry career at the end of the year.
Very soon, yes.
Yeah. And Lori's been an incredible servant to the state and educated all of us, whether you agree with her or not on a particular issue. She has educated all of us in the fine points of things. And Kathy and I at Almanac, we help authors move a lot of books. I can honestly say that for folks of kind of this generation, this demographic group in the audience, that this is perfect for holiday gift giving. So with that, thank you very much, and go buy a book.